If you're a fan of Bridgerton, I bet you've wondered who was the real inspiration for the imperious, wig-towering, gossip-hungry Queen Charlotte that rules the ballroom on Netflix. She commands every scene she's in. A woman who can make or break a debutante's entire season with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a sharp remark. But here's the thing. This queen wasn't simply plucked from the imagination of Shonda Rhimes' writer's room. She was inspired by someone who walked the long, candle-lit corridors of Buckingham House more than 2 centuries ago. And while the fictional Queen Charlotte thrives on scandal and spectacle, the real woman lived a life threaded with unexpected contradictions, a mixture of grandeur and quiet sorrow, of whispered rumours and very real responsibilities. Tonight, you'll discover who she really was, and I promise the truth will surprise you. For one thing, she wasn't born in London, or even in Britain. She didn't grow up expecting to be queen. And yet, before her 18th birthday was over, she was crowned the consort of one of Europe's most powerful monarchs. Her story contains not only the glitter of jewels and the rustle of gowns, but also rumours about her ancestry that scandalised the nobility, a husband whose mind betrayed him, and the exhausting burden of raising more royal children than the Bridgerton'S could ever fit around their dining table. So, if you thought Bridgerton was filled with drama, wait until you hear about the queen who inspired it all. The truth is stranger, sadder, and in some ways far more fascinating. Settle into bed, let the candlelight flicker low in your imagination, and prepare to meet the woman history remembers, though not always kindly, as the real Queen Charlotte. And before we step into her story, if you're listening with tired eyes, do me a gentle favour. Tap the like button, subscribe for more sleepy journeys through history, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I love imagining these stories keeping company across time zones and bedrooms all over the world. Imagine this. It's the mid-18th century. Carriages rattle over cobblestone streets, powdered wigs are reaching architectural heights, and the smell of roast beef mingles with the slightly less romantic odour of horse manure in London's squares. At court, diamonds sparkle, musicians tune their instruments, and everybody is waiting for the arrival of a young bride. This girl, because she is really still a girl, comes not from the familiar powerhouses of Europe like France or Austria, but from a small, rather sleepy duchy in northern Germany. Hardly anyone outside of a geography classroom could have pointed to it on a map. She spoke little English, had modest schooling, and spent most of her life far from the glittering centres of power. No one in London society had ever expected to see her face, and yet, in a twist worthy of a Bridgerton plotline, she was about to become the Queen of Great Britain. Picture the contrast. On one hand, Britain was already striding into its age of empire, its navy prowling the seas, its merchants piling up fortunes in sugar, cotton, and tea. The political stakes were high, the press was nosy, and the aristocracy was as petty as ever. On the other hand, this shy teenage duchess had grown up in a countryside palace that was more draught than splendour, reading books about botany and playing the harpsichord with a competence that was charming but hardly headline-worthy. It was like plucking a debutante from a provincial assembly room and thrusting her onto the stage at the opera, except in this case, the stage was the British throne. The match itself was arranged with the sort of brisk efficiency that makes modern dating apps look slow. King George III, young, serious, and eager to prove himself, needed a wife who wouldn't bring a tangled web of alliances or expensive wars with her. Enter our German princess, whose greatest political virtue was that she came with no baggage, no ambitious family angling for influence, no empire demanding favours. She was, in short, politically convenient. And yet, here's the first surprise. When she arrived, the English court, usually quick to sniff out any flaw, didn't instantly mock her. Instead, they seemed curious. The newspapers reported on her journey as if it were the social event of the decade. Imagine the gossip sheets of today, except with quill pens and a lot more ink stains. Carriages lined the streets, ladies craned their necks, and everyone whispered, "Who is she? Will she be beautiful? Will she charm the king? Or will this be one of those awkward royal matches where the couple barely tolerates each other over breakfast? She herself had no illusions. Letters from her youth show she was acutely aware of her modest upbringing and the scrutiny she was about to endure. But there she was, arriving in London in September 1761, stepping into a whirlwind of ceremony, strangers, and expectations. She married the king on the very day she arrived. No time for courtship, no weeks of candlelit dances or long walks in the garden. One carriage ride, one set of vows, and she was suddenly Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. If that feels rushed, well, it was. Even Daphne Bridgerton, at her most desperate for a proposal, had more breathing room. But that was the reality of 18th century dynastic politics. Efficiency over romance. Crowns didn't have time for dinner dates. From the beginning, her life in Britain was one of contradictions. Outwardly, she had all the trappings of majesty, gilded coaches, glittering gowns, the endless bowing and scraping of courtiers. But privately, she was navigating a world where she was perpetually the outsider. German by birth, struggling with English, cautious with her manners, and always aware that the court could turn on her with a whisper. It didn't help that Britain itself was a nation in flux. The empire was growing, the American colonies were restless, and Parliament was never exactly a serene workplace. George III was determined to be a hands-on monarch, one who ruled rather than merely reigned. That meant Charlotte, by extension, was pulled into a life of ceaseless responsibility. Her marriage might not have been chosen for romance, but it was expected to be rock solid, a shining model of domestic virtue for the nation. Here, history gives us another twist. Unlike many of his Hanoverian predecessors, George III was actually faithful to her. For a while at least, theirs was considered an unusually close marriage by royal standards. No mistresses flaunted at court, no rival households draining the treasury. To the scandal-hungry aristocracy, this was almost disappointing. How can you feed the gossip columns when the king is dutiful and the queen is shy? So, in those early years, Charlotte lived in a strange position, adored by the king, watched by the court, and still, somehow, barely noticed by history. She wasn't dazzling in the way of a Marie Antoinette. She wasn't notorious like Catherine the Great. Instead, she was practical, modest, and, dare I say it, a little bit boring, which of course makes her perfect for us tonight. Because boring at court was never truly boring. Beneath the surface of restraint, the cracks were already showing. Whispers about her foreignness, jokes about her heavy German accent, quiet remarks about whether she looked entirely European in her features. All of these undercurrents were gathering, waiting to explode into the rumours that still follow her name today. So, as you picture her first nights in Britain, the young queen in a palace too grand for her comfort, sitting beside a king who was still something of a stranger, and facing a nation that hadn't decided what to make of her yet, remember this. The Bridgerton queen we see on screen, with her cutting remarks and commanding presence, may be fictionalized, but she reflects a deeper truth. This was a woman who had to carve out authority in a court that saw her as both essential and alien, and that, in itself, is enough drama to keep Lady Whistledown's quill busy for years. To understand how this rather unassuming teenager ended up as queen, we have to travel back to her homeland, Mecklenburg-Strelitz. If you've never heard of it, don't feel bad. Most of Britain hadn't either. This was no glittering Vienna, no stylish Paris, no booming London. Mecklenburg was a quiet German duchy dotted with forests, lakes, and drafty little palaces that struggled to look impressive even when candlelight was doing its best to flatter them. Charlotte, or to give her the mouthful of a full name, Sophia Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, was born in 1744. Her father died when she was still young, which meant she grew up with her widowed mother in a court that was more frugal than fabulous. Money was tight, as was opportunity. For a girl of her station, the greatest ambition wasn't to command armies or shape politics, but to marry advantageously, though, in Charlotte's case, the definition of advantageous was about to stretch to extraordinary lengths. Her education was polite but unremarkable. She learned the expected accomplishments, a bit of music, she played the harpsichord, some needlework, passable French, and a smattering of the sciences, which were fashionable in enlightened circles. Unlike the glamorous heroines of Bridgerton, Charlotte didn't grow up practicing witty repartee for a London ballroom. Instead, she spent her youth reading about plants and natural philosophy, corresponding with local tutors, and acquiring a reputation for modest intelligence and good behaviour. She was, in other words, the sort of girl mothers liked and society barely noticed, which is perhaps why she was so appealing to George III. Let's set the stage. Britain in 1761 had a new king, young George, who had ascended the throne at just 22. Unlike his flamboyant grandfather, George II, or the string of mistresses collecting monarchs before him, George III was earnest, sober, and determined to embody virtue. He famously declared that he wanted a marriage based on domestic happiness and fidelity. A radical thought, considering most of his predecessors treated queens like wallpaper, decorative but ignorable. So, when his advisors began searching for a bride, the criteria were clear. She must be Protestant, politically unentangled, healthy enough to bear heirs, and, perhaps most importantly, unlikely to overshadow the king himself. Britain didn't want another consort with the charisma of Catherine the Great or the extravagance of Marie Antoinette. They wanted someone who would quietly blend into the background of the monarchy while producing a nice, steady supply of princes and princesses. In this sense, Charlotte was perfect. She was of the right religion, from a small state with no imperial strings attached, and came with a reputation for modesty. She had no meddling uncles with armies to command, no vast estates that might complicate Britain's delicate balance of alliances. Best of all, she was young enough, just 17, to be moulded into the role the crown required. The negotiations were brisk. George's advisors dispatched envoys, checked her lineage, and declared her suitable. Charlotte herself had little say in the matter. She knew her fate was to marry well, but one suspects even she hadn't imagined well meant becoming the queen of an empire. When news of the match was announced, the little German court must have buzzed with disbelief. Their quiet duchy was about to send a daughter into the very centre of world politics. Her journey to Britain reads almost like a fairy tale, though a somewhat damp and seasick one. In August 1761, she left her homeland, travelling across Europe with a small retinue. The sea voyage was stormy, and poor Charlotte reportedly spent much of it ill. Imagine the dread, barely out of childhood, shivering on a ship, knowing that on the other side she was weighted by a strange husband, a foreign language, and a nation ready to dissect her every gesture. When she finally arrived at Harwich, she was met with ceremonial fanfare. Crowds gathered to glimpse the new bride, craning to see if she was beautiful, if she looked regal, if she appeared worthy of their king. In truth, contemporary accounts describe her as plain, but with an agreeable countenance. Not the glowing endorsement every teenage girl dreams of, but in royal matchmaking, a pleasant face and modest manners could count for far more than sparkling beauty. There was no leisurely engagement. George wanted efficiency. She was whisked to London, and within hours of stepping onto English soil, she was married. The ceremony took place on September 8, 1761, at St. James's Palace, attended by the full splendour of the court. The bride wore a silver brocade gown heavy with jewels, though one suspects she had little time to admire her reflection before being paraded in front of her new subjects. Imagine it. One morning, you're a German duchess no one outside your region has heard of. By evening, you're the Queen of Great Britain and Ireland, every movement scrutinised, every smile interpreted, every stumble whispered about by ladies fanning themselves in the galleries. It was dizzying, terrifying, and irreversible. As for George, he was, by most accounts, immediately fond of her. Their wedding night was described, in those carefully veiled terms historians love, as satisfactory. More importantly, he valued her sincerity and lack of pretense. He was a man who wanted a dutiful partner, not a glittering distraction, and in Charlotte, he found someone who could fulfill that vision. Of course, Not everyone was thrilled. London society, hungry for drama, picked over her appearance and her accent. Was she pretty enough? Did she speak English gracefully? Would she embarrass the nation abroad? The whispers began, faint but insistent, the way they always do when a newcomer threatens the delicate balance of social expectations. And while her crown was literal, it was also precarious, resting as much on perception as on ceremony. Still, for the moment, Charlotte was secure. She had the king's affection, the nation's curiosity, and the formalities of power. In the months after her marriage, she was presented as a model of domestic virtue. Together with George, she attended balls, receptions, and concerts, appearing in the picture of marital harmony. No scandal, no mistress, no rival. For courtiers addicted to gossip, it was almost disappointing. But behind the polished facade, the real challenges were only beginning. She was a teenager, thrust into one of the most demanding roles in Europe, expected to embody grace, produce heirs, and navigate a court where every smile and misstep became fodder for political intrigue. The girl from Mecklenburg had succeeded in marrying well, but at the cost of anonymity, privacy, and the simple comfort of home. It is here, in these first years of her reign, that we begin to see the outlines of the Queen Charlotte who would inspire Bridgerton. A woman both adored and criticised, cherished by her husband, yet constantly othered by her adopted nation, and destined to live her life in the bright, unforgiving light of the crown. If marriage was meant to be Charlotte's crowning achievement, motherhood quickly became her daily occupation. And by daily, I mean constantly. For Charlotte, being Queen of Great Britain also meant becoming a one-woman nursery. In a time when producing heirs was the most valuable currency a queen could offer, Charlotte over-delivered. She gave birth to 15 children. 15. Even the most ambitious Bridgerton matriarch might have blinked at that number. Imagine the practicalities for a moment. In the space of 21 years, she was pregnant for nearly half her marriage. The palace, already echoing with the clatter of servants' shoes and the chatter of courtiers, now reverberated with the cries of infants, the scolding of nannies, and the relentless parade of cradle rockers and wet nurses. Buckingham House, later called Buckingham Palace, began to feel less like a stately royal residence and more like a very expensive, very overstaffed daycare centre. And yet, Charlotte threw herself into the role. She was, if not affectionate in the modern sense, at least devoted to her duty. Records show that she insisted on being present during her children's early years, overseeing their education and, in her own words, trying to instill good order and principles. In an age when royal offspring were often raised at arm's length by governesses, Charlotte's involvement was unusual. She may not have been a warm, story-reading, bedtime tucking sort of mother, the kind we imagine in sentimental portraits. But she was invested in her children's development, and she paid attention. Of course, with 15 of them, attention was a relative concept. You can almost picture her at the breakfast table, trying to remember which child was which, much like a modern parent scrolling frantically through a calendar of school pickups, soccer practices, and orthodontist appointments. Except in Charlotte's case, the appointments were piano lessons, military commissions, and marriage negotiations for dukes and duchesses in training. The children themselves were a mixed bunch, as all large families are. Some were brilliant, some troubled, some merely mediocre. George, the eldest, would inherit the throne, but spend much of his life clashing with his parents. William, another son, became king after him, though more remembered for his naval career and his eventual habit of fathering illegitimate children by the dozen. The daughters, hemmed in by strict court life, often found themselves frustrated, pampered, yes, but also stifled, expected to remain at their mother's side long past the age when ordinary women would have married. It was, in many ways, a gilded cage. Charlotte's insistence on discipline didn't always endear her to her brood. Letters suggest that several of the daughters viewed her as cold and rigid. But this image must be balanced with other accounts. She encouraged their music, their reading, their moral conduct. In one respect, Charlotte was surprisingly modern. She valued her daughter's education. The idea of clever princesses, fluent in French and capable of debate, appealed to her. Though she may have kept them cloistered, she wanted them sharp. Still, the strain of 15 pregnancies and the endless responsibility of child-rearing took its toll. Portraits from her youth show Charlotte as plump-cheeked, with bright eyes and a lively expression. By middle age, after decades of childbirth, worry, and the growing instability of her husband, she appeared worn, heavy-set, her features described cruelly by contemporaries as coarse. It was not merely age, it was exhaustion made visible. And yet, despite the fatigue, Charlotte found moments of joy in her domestic kingdom. She loved music and encouraged her children to play instruments and perform. She adored botany, transforming the gardens at Kew into one of the most celebrated botanical collections in Europe, and teaching her children to appreciate the natural sciences. If Bridgerton's queen is imagined as always scheming over gossip and matchmaking, the real Charlotte could often be found among her plants, peering at petals and sketching roots, hardly the stuff of scandal, but revealing a quieter kind of passion. One cannot overlook the symbolism of her fertility. In an age obsessed with dynastic stability, every child she bore was both a personal achievement and a political statement. The Hanoverian dynasty, shaky only a generation earlier, was suddenly secure. If one son faltered, there were plenty more in reserve. The dynasty was cemented in flesh and blood, in the royal nursery that never seemed to empty. But here lies the contradiction. The very children she produced, the proof of her success as queen and consort, would also become the source of lifelong anxiety. As George III's health began to fail, and as his madness became the subject of whispers and then open debate, Charlotte's role as mother expanded into something closer to regent. She had to manage not just the king but also his heir, the fractious Prince of Wales, who openly defied his parents and mocked their values. To have 15 children was a triumph. To manage them was a nightmare. Modern parents complain about coordinating bedtime for 3 kids. Charlotte tried to manage the egos, ambitions, and grievances of princes and princesses who were also political pawns. Some rebelled, some obeyed. Some sank into scandal. All of them reflected back on her, for better or worse. The irony is almost painful. She had been chosen for her simplicity, her lack of entanglements, her promise of quiet domestic virtue. And she delivered, 15 times over. But far from making her life easier, her abundant motherhood complicated everything. Each child represented another avenue for public disappointment, another headline waiting to embarrass the monarchy, another reminder that queens might control nurseries, but not destinies. It is here, perhaps, that the fictional and the historical Charlotte overlap most intriguingly. The Bridgerton queen commands the room by arranging marriages and mocking failures. The real queen, though far more subdued, was nevertheless defined by matchmaking. Except the matches were her children's, and the stakes were dynastic survival. So, when you next watch a Bridgerton ball and see Queen Charlotte raise an eyebrow, imagine instead the real Charlotte, weary from pregnancies, juggling the demands of a king slipping into madness, a palace bursting with restless princes and frustrated princesses, and the unrelenting pressure to hold the dynasty together. She may not have had the drama of wigs adorned with caged songbirds, but her reality was no less exhausting. And unlike the Bridgerton matriarch, whose season ends after 8 polite episodes, Charlotte's season as mother to the realm lasted a lifetime. If Queen Charlotte's 15 children secured the dynasty, what really secured her place in the imagination of later generations was not her maternity, but her face. Not her crowns, not her gowns, not even her gardens, but her face. Because somewhere in the candlelit galleries of London society, people began to whisper. The whispers were not about whether she was plain or modest or dull. Those were already common enough. These whispers were sharper, more speculative, and, in the racially obsessed world of 18th century Europe, more scandalous? Was Charlotte entirely white? To modern ears, this might sound like the setup to a particularly tedious comment section, but in the stratified world of Georgian England, where lineage was scrutinized down to the tiniest genealogical thread, such gossip carried weight. It was whispered in drawing rooms, noted by painters, and later debated by historians. The suggestion was simple but explosive. Charlotte may have had African ancestry through her Portuguese royal line. The root of the rumour traces back to the 15th century, to a Portuguese noblewoman named Madrigana, described in contemporary chronicles as a Moor. She was a mistress of King Afonso III of Portugal, and if you squint hard enough at genealogical charts, she appears as a distant ancestor in Charlotte's family tree. By the 18th century, that bloodline had been diluted across centuries of intermarriage with European nobility. Yet the idea lingered. A Moorish mistress, a whispered taint in the pedigree. It was enough to make gossip salivate. And of course, once people started looking for it, they claimed to see it. Portraits of Charlotte became the subject of forensic gazing. Some contemporaries described her nose as broad, her lips as full, her features as un-European. Others dismissed these descriptions as exaggerations or the cruel gossip of courtiers with nothing better to do. The truth is, 18th century portraiture was more about flattering patrons than recording biology, and even the evidence we think we see today is filtered through layers of stylization. Still, the whispers persisted. Horace Walpole, that catty chronicler of Georgian high society, hinted at her appearance with his usual flair for poison-tipped pens. Later writers, both in Britain and abroad, repeated the speculation, sometimes to insult her, sometimes to romanticize her as a symbol of diversity in royal bloodlines. And in the centuries that followed, those whispers became louder, especially in the context of Britain's history with slavery and race. Now, before you imagine Charlotte being cornered at a Bridgerton-style ball by debutantes whispering about her cheekbones, let's be clear. In her lifetime, the rumours never exploded into a full scandal. They lingered at the edges, muttered in private, occasionally referenced in art. No one dared make it the centrepiece of a pamphlet or political attack. After all, Charlotte was the Queen, and George III was notoriously strict about maintaining dignity at court. But the fact that it existed at all is revealing. Why? Because it tells us what society feared. Britain in the 18th century was knee-deep in colonial expansion, profiting from the slave trade and obsessed with hierarchies of race and class. To imagine that the Queen herself might carry African blood was both thrilling and horrifying to a society built on those hierarchies. Thrilling, because gossip loves nothing more than a paradox. Horrifying, because it threatened the illusion of purity that so many in the aristocracy clung to. Fast forward to the 20th and 21st centuries, and historians began to revisit these whispers with modern tools. Some argued there was genuine merit. Genealogical studies do trace Charlotte's line back to Madrigana, and the descriptions of her features suggest a possibility. Others countered that it was flimsy, based more on prejudice than proof. After all, if one goes back far enough, almost every royal house in Europe connects to non-European ancestry somewhere along the line. The human family tree is a tangle, not a straight line. And yet, flimsy or not, the rumour stuck. It became part of her story, re-emerging in academic papers, in novels, in newspaper articles, and finally, most spectacularly, in Bridgerton. The show embraced it, casting Golda Rochouval as Queen Charlotte and weaving her mixed-race identity into the storyline as a way of imagining an alternate history, a Britain where diversity was not just tolerated but central to the aristocracy. It's an interpretation, not a documentary, but it owes everything to those centuries-old whispers. For the sleepy historian in us, this is where fact and fiction dance together. The real Charlotte may never have faced an open scandal about her heritage, but she carried the burden of being visibly different in ways her contemporaries noticed. The fictional Charlotte on Netflix transforms that difference into power, striding through the ballroom with wigs like fortresses and a wit sharp enough to cut diamonds. Both versions, in their own way, reflect the same truth. To be queen was never simply to wear a crown. It was to embody the fantasies and fears of an entire society. Now here's where the dry humour creeps in. Imagine poor Charlotte sitting in her drawing room, trying to read about her beloved botany, while somewhere across London, a group of aristocrats are squinting at her latest portrait like amateur detectives. "Do you see it?" one whispers. "Look at the nose." Another leans in, nodding solemnly, as if they've solved the great mystery of the age. Meanwhile, Charlotte herself is probably wondering whether her latest shipment of rare plants from the colonies will survive the journey. The contrast between her daily life and the gossip swirling around her is striking. She was busy raising children, supporting the arts, tending to her husband's fragile health, and building one of the finest gardens in Europe. Society, meanwhile, was busy measuring her nostrils. If ever there were proof that gossip is timeless, it is this. What we can say with certainty is that Charlotte's rumoured ancestry did not diminish her influence. She remained queen for nearly 6 decades, longer than almost any consort in British history. She survived scandal, war, and the decline of her husband's mind. She anchored the dynasty through sheer endurance. And perhaps that endurance, more than her genealogy, is what makes her so compelling. So when Bridgerton gives us a queen who revels in her difference, who commands respect by leaning into her uniqueness, it is not such a stretch. The real Charlotte may not have swept into balls demanding gossip updates, but she did inhabit a role where her very existence challenged expectations. And that, more than wigs or whispers, is the real scandal. She survived in a world that didn't quite know what to make of her. Up until now, Queen Charlotte's story might sound like the usual royal fairy tale with a few odd twists. A shy girl married to a king, 15 children, some whispers about ancestry, and a lot of garden parties at Kew. But if history has a way of sneaking darkness into even the brightest halls, then Charlotte's darkness came in the form of her husband's mind. George III, the man who had once seemed like her anchor, faithful, diligent, even affectionate, began to unravel. Not in the small ways we all do, with occasional bouts of forgetfulness or irritation, but in dramatic, frightening collapses that shook not just their household, but the entire nation. The first signs appeared in the 1760s, just a few years into their marriage. George was prone to fits of agitation, long rambling speeches, and sudden bursts of energy that seemed unnatural. He could talk for hours without pause, words tumbling out so quickly his listeners could barely follow. He would repeat himself, switch topics mid-sentence, and behave in ways that were, for a king expected to embody dignity, deeply unsettling. Imagine Charlotte sitting beside him at dinner while he launched into a monologue about agriculture, speaking so fast and so long that she could hardly get a word in. The courtiers around the table would lower their eyes, pretending to focus on their soup, while silently thinking, something is terribly wrong. By the 1780s, the problem could no longer be ignored. George suffered what we now recognise as severe mental health crises, what his contemporaries simply called madness. He raved, he screamed, he foamed at the mouth. He had to be physically restrained by his attendants. One report describes him talking for hours until he collapsed, his voice hoarse, his body drenched in sweat. Another records him mistaking people around him for others, as if the world itself had slipped out of focus. And through all of this, Charlotte was there. At first she tried to comfort him. She had been raised to duty after all, and her sense of responsibility was strong. But as his episodes grew more violent, she began to fear him. There are accounts of her fleeing rooms when his rages turned toward her, terrified of what her once loving husband might do in his confusion. It is here that Charlotte's life diverges from the glittery fantasy of Bridgerton. On screen, she is untouchable, the sharpest wit in the room, the orchestrator of others' romances. In reality, she was increasingly isolated, the wife of a man whose illness dominated every corner of her existence. Instead of matchmaking, she spent nights pacing corridors, wondering if the king would recognize her in the morning. The public, of course, was fascinated. Newspapers speculated, pamphlets whispered, caricaturists sharpened their pens. The king's madness was both tragedy and entertainment, depending on which side of the palace gates you stood. Ordinary people pitied Charlotte. Some even admired her stoicism. But pity can be a cruel gift. It comes wrapped in judgment, with ribbons of gossip and bows of ridicule. Politically, George's illness created a vacuum. Who would govern if the king could not? Parliament debated Regency Acts, factions formed, and Charlotte herself found her role shifting. Though never officially regent, she became the de facto head of the royal household, managing affairs, shielding the king from scrutiny, and, in some ways, ruling in his stead. This was no triumphal power grab, it was survival. She did not seek authority, but authority landed on her shoulders, like a weight she could never set down. The emotional cost was immense. Letters from the period suggest Charlotte grew increasingly withdrawn. She avoided court appearances, spending more time at Windsor or Kew, retreating into the safety of her gardens and her children. But even there, peace was elusive. George's illness was unpredictable. At times he seemed to recover, his old self peeking through, only to collapse again in frightening spirals. The cruelest part was the uncertainty. A widow at least knows her fate. Charlotte lived in a state of perpetual suspense, never knowing if her husband would greet her with tenderness or madness. Her children, too, became sources of stress. The Prince of Wales, the future George IV, openly rebelled, mocking his parents, amassing debts, and carrying on scandalous affairs. Charlotte's daughters, trapped in her protective household, grew bitter and resentful, some accusing her of smothering them. To the public, she appeared severe, even cold. But perhaps that coldness was armor, a way of surviving a life that demanded more endurance than joy. And yet, here lies one of history's ironies. For all the sadness, Charlotte and George remained, in some strange way, devoted. Even in his madness, George sometimes called out for her, asking where his wife was, insisting she be near. He had no mistresses, no rival queen. She was his one true partner, even if his mind no longer consistently recognized her. Their marriage, begun with haste and practicality, endured through decades of turbulence. A love story, written not in passion, but in persistence. Dry humor creeps in here, because one cannot help but notice the absurdity of expectations. Charlotte had been chosen precisely because she was thought unlikely to cause trouble. She was modest, unremarkable, politically harmless, and yet, history handed her one of the most dramatic burdens imaginable. The care of a husband who was king by title, but incapacitated by illness. So much for an easy life in the shadows. It's worth pausing to reflect on how the world treated mental illness in the 18th century. There were no diagnoses of bipolar disorder or porphyria, no gentle therapies, no understanding of chemical imbalances. There was simply madness, a word that encompassed everything from depression to schizophrenia. Treatments were brutal, bleeding, blistering, restraints. George endured all of it, sometimes violently, sometimes pitifully. Charlotte had to watch, powerless, her children watching with her, the monarchy itself teetering on the edge of collapse. This was not the glamorous life of a queen, not the polished ballroom of Bridgerton. It was endurance, sorrow, and an endless performance of dignity before a world eager to sneer. And so, Charlotte grew harder. Portraits from her later years show a woman with a heavy face, deep lines, eyes that seem to look past the viewer into some private abyss. The young Duchess from Mecklenburg was gone. In her place was a queen who had endured 6 decades of monarchy, motherhood, and madness, and who still managed to hold the dynasty together. If the Bridgerton Queen Charlotte commands respect by sheer force of personality, the real Queen Charlotte commanded it by sheer force of survival. And sometimes, survival is the most dramatic story of all. After so many storms, political upheavals, her husband's illness, the endless demands of 15 children. It is almost a relief to turn to the quieter corners of Queen Charlotte's life, because if she is remembered today as the long-suffering consort of a troubled king, she was also a woman with genuine interests, passions and quirks that left their mark on culture. She wasn't just the keeper of the royal nursery or the reluctant regent in waiting. She was also, in her own way, a tastemaker. Let's begin with music, because here Charlotte shines. She loved it, not in the way some monarchs pretend to love music by nodding politely at concerts, but in the way of someone who genuinely found joy and refuge in it. She played the harpsichord herself, well enough to impress professional musicians, and she filled her household with. If you picture Bridgerton'S balls, with string quartets tucked in the corner playing modern pop hits in classical style, imagine Charlotte's real drawing rooms with the music of Handel, Haydn, and, most famously, a young Mozart. Yes, Mozart. When he was only 8 years old, the child prodigy performed for Queen Charlotte at court in 1764. She was charmed, and she, along with George, became patrons of his early work. One can imagine the tiny Mozart bowing before the Queen, his feet barely touching the floor, while Charlotte, exhausted from children of her own, smiled at this borrowed child who dazzled everyone with his genius. Charlotte also supported Handel, whose grand oratorios became woven into the fabric of British ceremonial life. She and George founded what would become the Royal Academy of Music. She wasn't flamboyant about it, but she put her weight behind culture, ensuring that music was not just entertainment, but a royal priority. If music was her escape indoors, then botany was her escape outdoors. Charlotte adored plants. She expanded the gardens at Kew into what would later become the world-renowned Royal Botanic Gardens. Under her patronage, Kew became a centre of scientific exchange, collecting specimens from around the globe. Ships would arrive from the colonies, not only with cargoes of sugar or tea, but with rare plants packed carefully in soil and moss, destined for her gardens. There is something almost poetic about this image. While courtiers gossiped about her ancestry, while Parliament bickered about her husband's competence, Charlotte was in her garden, examining petals, learning Latin names, sketching roots. The world saw a queen. She saw the veins of a leaf, the bloom of a flower, the quiet miracle of growth. In some ways, it was the only corner of life she could control. Plants did not rebel like sons or collapse like kings. They grew when nurtured, bloomed when tended, died when neglected. Steady, predictable, honest. She was not content to merely admire. She studied, corresponded with botanists, and lent her name to plants. The bird of paradise flower, Strelitzia reginae, was named in her honour. Strelitz for her birthplace, Reginae for her queenship. Every time one blooms, with its dramatic orange and blue petals resembling a tropical bird, it is a reminder of a queen who loved the natural world. Not a bad legacy for a woman who often felt trapped inside palaces. And then there were the dogs. Charlotte adored Pomeranians, those fluffy little companions with more attitude than size. She brought them to court, bred them, and set the fashion for them. If you've ever seen a spoiled Pomeranian trotting down a city street today, wearing a bow or riding in a handbag, you can thank Queen Charlotte. She made them chic. It's almost comical. A woman surrounded by princes, princesses, and politicians, finding comfort in a tiny, yappy dog. But perhaps it makes perfect sense. Dogs, unlike courtiers, did not lie. They did not gossip about noses or lips or ancestry. They loved her simply for who she was, not for the crown she wore. Charlotte's cultural contributions extended beyond her personal interests. She helped shape the character of the British royal family as patrons of the arts and sciences, a tradition her descendants continued. She also influenced architecture, encouraging George's taste for classical simplicity over Rococo excess. Their preference for modest domesticity, at least compared to some continental courts, gave the monarchy a tone of respectability, even when scandal brewed beneath. And yet, even in these quieter pursuits, the irony remained. She was not remembered for them. For all her support of Mozart, her passion for plants, her affection for dogs, her historical reputation was overshadowed by her husband's madness and her own supposed dullness. In portraits, she appears stiff, heavy, sometimes even dour, hardly the lively queen tending gardens or laughing at a puppy's antics. It is a reminder that history often forgets the soft details in favour of the hard dramas. Still, the traces remain, if you look for them. Visit Kew Gardens today, and you walk among trees and glasshouses that owe their existence to her curiosity. Listen to Handel's oratorios, and you hear music she promoted. Watch a Pomeranian strut down the street, and you see her legacy wagging its tail. It is worth pausing here, in this softer chapter, to note the contrast with Bridgerton. On screen, Charlotte is defined almost entirely by spectacle. Wigs the size of furniture, gowns dripping in jewels, lines delivered with delicious sharpness. The real Charlotte, by contrast, found her joy in the ordinary. Children's music lessons, sketches of flowers, the companionship of dogs. One queen commands a ballroom with her cutting wit. The other finds solace in the rhythm of nature. Both are performances of power, but one was played for television, the other for survival. Perhaps this is why Bridgerton's reinvention works so well. By amplifying her into a theatrical monarch, it compensates for the way history flattened her. The fictional Queen Charlotte is everything the real one might have been if she had been freed from duty, from gossip, from the endless strain of palace life. A woman who could indulge in grandeur rather than hide in gardens. And yet, I like to think the real Charlotte, with soil under her nails from planting, with dog hair clinging to her skirts, with music echoing through her corridors, had a richness of her own. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. It sustained her through decades of difficulty. And in the end, perhaps that is the truest form of power. To create small, lasting joys in the midst of overwhelming burdens. For all her gardens, her music, and her dogs, Queen Charlotte's later years were marked less by joy than by solitude. It is one of history's cruelties. The marriage that began with haste and, for a time, genuine devotion, ended not in betrayal or scandal, but in silence. The silence of a husband lost to his own mind. George III's illness, once intermittent, eventually became permanent. By 1810, after years of decline, he was judged incapable of ruling. His son, the Prince of Wales, that extravagant, debt-ridden, mistress-collecting heir, was formally appointed as Prince Regent. George was confined to Windsor Castle, his mind clouded, his body frail. Charlotte, by then in her 60s, found herself queen without a king, a consort without companionship, a wife without a marriage. This was no dramatic widowhood in black veils and poetic mourning. It was worse, a half-widowhood that stretched on for 8 long years while her husband still lived. She could not grieve him fully, because he was not fully gone. But she could not reach him either, because the man she had known was no longer there. Imagine the strain. Every day the question, would he recognize her today? Would he know her name? Sometimes he called out for her. Sometimes he looked at her with suspicion. Sometimes he did not seem to notice her presence at all. The intimacy of marriage had been replaced with the distance of illness, a void that no crown, no court, no garden could fill. Charlotte's role narrowed. She withdrew from public life, appearing rarely at court functions. Her daughters, many of whom remained unmarried and lived with her, became her companions, though not always happily. Some of them accused her of being overly controlling, of keeping them too close. They longed for freedom, for marriages, for households of their own. But Charlotte, scarred by the chaos of George's illness, clung to them. Perhaps she feared letting go of the only stability left to her. The Prince Regent, her eldest son, added to her burdens. He and Charlotte were often at odds. He resented her influence, criticized her severity, and in turn she disapproved of his extravagance and immorality. Their relationship became so strained that at times they barely spoke. For Charlotte, who had spent her life trying to maintain dignity and order. The regent's flamboyant lifestyle, his mistresses, his debts, his endless renovations of Carlton House, must have felt like a personal insult. Physically, too, she declined. Years of pregnancies, stress, and sorrow left her frail. She developed dropsy, an illness that caused her body to swell painfully. Walking became difficult. Travel was exhausting. Yet she carried on with the stubborn endurance that had always defined her. She still presided over family dinners, still attended concerts when she could, still received visitors, though with less sparkle and more weariness. There is a tragic irony in this stage of her life. Charlotte, who had once been chosen for her simplicity, for her supposed ability to blend quietly into the background of monarchy, ended up at the very centre of its most painful drama. She had held the household together through George's early illnesses, borne the children who secured the dynasty, managed the court with steady hands when her husband could not. And yet, her reward was loneliness. Her death came in November 1818, at the age of 74. She died at Kew Palace, surrounded not by grandeur, but by family. Her son, the Prince Regent, at her side, along with several of her daughters. George, by then completely lost to madness, never knew she was gone. He survived her by just over a year, passing away in 1820, never again aware of the woman who had shared his throne, his children, and his burdens. When Charlotte's coffin was carried to St. George's Chapel at Windsor, she was laid to rest not far from the man who had been both her greatest ally and her greatest sorrow. The court mourned her, though not extravagantly. She had never been a flamboyant queen. She left behind no trail of scandals, no monuments of excess. Instead, she left gardens, music, children, and the memory of endurance. In the grand sweep of British history, her reign as consort is often overshadowed. George III is remembered as the mad king who lost America. The Prince Regent is remembered as a flamboyant spendthrift. Charlotte, sandwiched between them, is often reduced to footnotes: the quiet wife, the tired mother, the plain queen. But if we look closely, her life tells a deeper story. One of duty, of survival, of finding small joys in music, flowers, and pets when larger joys were denied. And perhaps that is why she works so well as the inspiration for Bridgerton'S Queen. The series exaggerates her into a towering figure of wit and command, yes, but beneath the wigs and the gossip, there is a truth borrowed from history. Queen Charlotte was a woman who endured. She endured gossip about her ancestry, the exhaustion of childbirth, the loneliness of a half-widowhood, and the burden of holding together a monarchy threatened by madness. It may not be glamorous, but it is powerful. Survival often is. So what, in the end, do we make of Queen Charlotte? A shy German teenager who married a stranger and became Queen of Great Britain. A mother of 15 who spent decades surrounded by nurseries and tutors. A patron of music and gardens who welcomed Mozart at 8 years old and gave her name to flowers still blooming today. A woman whispered about her ancestry, pitied by her husband, criticized by her children, and remembered by history with faint outlines rather than bold strokes. In some ways, she is the perfect queen for bedtime storytelling precisely because she is not overwhelming. She is not Catherine the Great, rewriting laws and toppling lovers. She is not Marie Antoinette, dancing on the edge of revolution with diamonds in her hair. She is not Elizabeth I, blazing with power and self-determination. Charlotte was quieter, enduring rather than dazzling, steady rather than flamboyant, which makes her, strangely enough, all the more human. And yet, like all queens, she left traces. Visit Windsor or Kew and you walk in her footsteps. Study the family tree of Europe's monarchies and you see her branches spreading everywhere. Her children and grandchildren married into royal houses across the continent. Victoria, her granddaughter, would later embody the idea of domestic virtue Charlotte herself had tried to model. Even Charlotte's quieter obsessions outlived her. The gardens at Kew flourished, the music she supported endured, and yes, Pomeranians remained a fashionable nuisance in palaces and parlours. But perhaps her most curious legacy is the one no one could have predicted: her reinvention on Netflix. When Bridgerton premiered, many viewers thought Queen Charlotte was entirely fictional. After all, here was a monarch with wigs so vast they could shelter small families, with lines sharp enough to make grown men wilt, with a presence that seemed too deliciously theatrical to be real. But then, whispers began to circulate, just as they had in her own lifetime. Was she real? Was there really a Queen Charlotte? And if so, did she look like this? Did she wield power in this way? The answer is both yes and no. The real Queen Charlotte did not run London's marriage market with a raised eyebrow. She did not preside over balls with feathered wigs the size of carriages. She did not spend her evenings gossiping over debutantes. But she was real, and people would whisper about her. And she did live a life threaded with duty, sorrow, and quiet strength. In a way, Bridgerton gives her back something history denied: spectacle. For centuries, Charlotte was remembered in dull portraits and dry footnotes, overshadowed by her husband's madness and her son's extravagance. But on screen, she becomes unforgettable. Golda Rochouval's Queen Charlotte is witty, commanding, larger than life. She fills the room, and though it may not be historically accurate, it captures something true about the weight Charlotte carried, the way her very presence, however modest, shaped an entire era. History often forgets women like her, women who do not seize thrones or ignite revolutions, but who hold the fragile pieces together when everything else is collapsing. It forgets the endurance, the quiet labor, the sacrifices that never make it into dramatic paintings. But fiction, sometimes, remembers. And in this case, fiction gave her new life. So the next time you watch Bridgerton and see Queen Charlotte raise a skeptical brow, remember the woman behind the character. Remember the shy girl from Mecklenburg who arrived in Britain seasick and married before she'd unpacked her trunks. Remember the queen who sat through childbirth after childbirth, who played music in her drawing rooms, who sketched flowers in her garden. Remember the wife who sat helpless as her husband's mind unraveled, who became a widow in all but name long before she was allowed to mourn. Because that is her true legacy, not the wigs, not the gossip, not even the dogs, though the dogs are a charming footnote. Her legacy is endurance. A woman who was not meant to dazzle, but who carried on anyway, decade after decade, leaving behind a monarchy still intact when she left it. And that, in its own quiet way, is every bit as powerful as the grandest ballroom scene in Bridgerton. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please tap the like button, subscribe for more journeys into the quieter corners of history, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love knowing where these tales are keeping you company. Until next time, sleep well, dream of candlelit ballrooms and forgotten worlds, and I'll see you in the next story. Script written by Clara Finch, because good stories always deserve a soul.